My next guest is Will McDonough, recently named one of the Global Forum on Education and Learning Top 100 Visionaries in Education for the year 2020. Will is an educator, author, diversity practitioner, speaker, and thought leader who was raised in a one-room schoolhouse in the mountains of northern New Hampshire. As a child of a street-performing juggler, storyteller, and teacher of the deaf and blind, Will combines his joy with the educational experiences of those around him. Currently, Will serves at the country school in Madison, Connecticut, where he's the director of community engagement, as well as a 7th and 8th grade history teacher, advisor, and cross-country coach. Will loves math, running, spending time outdoors with his family, and he and his partner would pull out 3 children and live in Guilford, Connecticut. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches in Hampshire College.
Yeah, so when I think about my trench story, or when I think about my role as an educator, my role as a teacher and an educator is so intertwined with who I am as a human. And I think that so much of who I am is who was modeled for me by the great teachers I had. And I saw such authenticity in them that for me, being in the trenches is something that I deal with every day. And when I say in the trenches, I don't think of it as trench warfare necessarily. I don't see myself as battling against anyone. I've always felt like being a teacher is such a beautiful practice because the parents, the students, and the educators in the classroom all want the same thing. There is no enemy. There is no competition in terms of like the other companies or corporations. Certainly you get on a sports field and you have that in a school, but the nature of being in the field of education is immersed with such goodness. So when you're in the trenches, for me, what that means as a teacher is you're immersed in the fragility and the messiness of this everyday experience of being human. And so for me, I think my trench story is really about overcoming some of my own struggles in terms of my own anxiety, my own attention deficit disorder, and creating these systems where I figure out what works for me, because I'm in a world where I have to help my students with their executive functioning. I teach 7th and 8th graders, and I have to be present for them. I have to make them laugh in a moment where there's a high level of intensity. I have to give them a chance to just be present and listen to them and hear what's going on in their days. And so I think for me, getting out of the trenches is, asking myself at the end of every day, was I a positive role model for these kids? Was I a good listener when someone needed to be listened to? Did I make time and value that? And, did I foster a sense of belonging in the classroom? Because my own curiosity and my own energy for people is what enables me to do the actual academic part well, to do the actual teaching, to do the engaging, to do that. And so I think for me, getting out of the trenches is every day at the end of the day, being able to close the door to my classroom and take a deep breath and look back and say, you know what? Moments where I myself was anxious, moments where I felt a little bit frazzled. The art of being a teacher is many things at once, and they're all true. And so I think for me, it's an everyday practice of thriving in the midst of this beautifully chaotic thing called middle school.
I really like how you put that in, just being able to kind of decompress, like you said, when the kids leave, reflect back on your day. So many of us forget to make it a point to think about what went well, what could we improve upon, but also not letting those quote unquote trench warfare days get you down, right? Because like you have your good days and you have your not so good days. Working with middle schoolers is what fuels your passion. So yeah, I really enjoy how you worded that. You kind of experience of being in the trenches. Talk a little bit about, I mentioned in the bio, so your parents, one of your parents was a teacher of the deaf and blind. So what did you learn, from your parents, and kind of how did that lead to wanting to be an educator yourself?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I mean, I think for everyone who's in education, there comes a time where where you realize this is where I want to be. This is what I want to do. You know, no one in this industry is doing it to necessarily become famous, and yet we're investing in human futures without the payout at the end, right? Where we're investing in these things and they cease to be our students every June, and then we get to watch them and see them if they come back, and to know that we did our part. And so for me, I think it makes sense to start at the beginning, you know, of my journey toward being a teacher. And both my parents were incredibly curious people. They loved learning and they celebrated learning. And even growing up, you know, in very humble beginnings in northern New Hampshire, in the countryside of a town of 3,000 people, and the mills shut down and lots of unemployment and poverty, you know, a pursuit of learning and a fascination with the world around me was always paramount. And so I think that living in the present tense and that innovative spirit and lowering associative barriers and always making connections is something both my parents had. You know, my dad is a storyteller and a juggler. It's all about, as a street performer, when I was born in Massachusetts, where they lived before we moved to New Hampshire. And you know, my dad would be in Boston Common telling stories to children who would gather around and listen, and just being attuned to that spirit of engaging with others and with strangers and making people feel comfortable, and using humor and using laughter and using these elements of improv have been so beneficial to who I've become as a camp leader and camp counselor, who I've become as a parent, who I've become as a teacher. And then, you know, there's the role that my mother played. And for anyone who, or in my experience, I should say, of spending time with young deaf people and deafblind people, and the distinction there is there are people who are deaf who can't hear or hard of hearing. There are people who are blind or visually impaired who can't see, but then there are people who are deaf blind. And that's someone who can do neither, who has impairment to both their eyes and their ears. And so my mother's experience was in both deafness and deaf blindness. So her real degree and her education early on was in deafness. And so when I've spent time with young deaf people, so much of their education is experiential, because you're trying to make up for the lack of explanation in language. And so you need to give yourself that experience, the project-based learning, the walking through the woods, and that level of inquiry and discovery. I remember with one young boy who was about 7, I was walking with my mom and my younger sister through the woods with him. And the 4 of us were together, and he felt thunder. He could feel something rumbling, and then he saw the lightning. And he asked us, he said, "Wait, what was that? Was there a sound?" Because he didn't know. And we said, "Yeah, there's a sound." And he said, "There's a sound that goes with lightning?" And he was signing. And, you know, my sister and my dad and my mom and I, we all sign. And we said, "Yeah, there's a sound." And he said, "And there's a sound with the crickets, and there's a sound." And he was like looking at things on the ground, and he's like, "The flowers?" And we said, "No, there's no sound with a flower." And then he stopped and he looked at us and he said, "What sound does a rainbow make?" And I think about that moment, because the shivers that went down my spine, and I was only 14 or 15 years old at the time, but I remember his inquiry and engagement and fascination, because he didn't have that sense. He was missing that. And so I think that experiential piece of teaching watching a young deaf child learn to understand the world and learn to understand something that's so mysterious to them, like what a hearing person's experience is, has been so beneficial to me as I differentiate for students with learning disabilities or with different types of strengths and weaknesses, and really trying to figure out where are the opportunities to engage with this person for whom this might not come as easily. And I've really gravitated as a middle school teacher away from saying, what do I want all my students to learn, or what do I want them to know, but to say, what do I want each of them to experience? Because I think if you start with the experience, and then what are they understanding through this experience? What are they learning through the experience? It helps me as a teacher, because sometimes it's something like I want every student to experience what it feels like to have a challenge that's too difficult for them. And maybe I ensure there's some guardrails around that. And right, we wrap it in careful cotton wool, and we prepare the students for that. And afterwards, maybe the grade or the assessment is actually them processing what was that like to not succeed the way you thought you might. But that's a challenge for me as an educator is, what do I want them to experience? Not just a walk in the woods or a trip to the river or a field trip or a guest speaker, but also those internal experiences. So I think both my parents, through the experience of storytelling and juggling, and then also, educating someone who's missing one of the senses that I myself take for granted as a hearing person, have been wildly beneficial to who I am as an educator.
Yeah, and not that many people have that background and experience, and seeing how the people who are missing one of the senses view the world. But for you to see that at such a young age, and hear him, see him sign, and when he asked that question, right, about do rainbows make sound, right, and then take that into your life as an educator and working with kids and seeing how they learn differently. How can you differentiate? So, being in a family that has parents that have those professions, I think has really formed you, like you said, as an educator. And you have a different perspective, I think, in how you can serve your students. Talk to me a little bit about, you talked about working at camp. And so you've been working at the Standing Rock camp. And then there's a model called Tinder Warrior. So how did you get involved in working at the camp? And talk to me a little bit about what a Tinder Warrior is.
Yeah, so I grew up going to a summer camp up in New Hampshire. I was a 5-year camper. It was an overnight sleepaway boys camp called Camp Belknap. And I then worked in their leadership for 10 years. And that was really where I fell in love with the pace of school, the pace of education, and specifically middle school. I think there are so many similarities between summer camp and teaching middle school, because the energy just has to be so sustained and you're so tired at the end of the day, but also so fulfilled. And so I spent those 15 years there, and then took a break when I started teaching in Connecticut, and had graduated from college, spent one final year at my camp, and then took 2 summers off. And it was during or 3 summers off, I guess. And it was during that time of kind of laying fallow a little bit that I started feeling, wow, I miss that. I miss the summer energy and that rush. And I got to talking with a friend of mine who had 2 young boys, and they were 11 and 13 at the time, I think. And he said, gosh, I think that as I watch my sons with male role models and lacrosse coaches and soccer coaches and teachers and people in their lives, neighbors, they're not really getting like a clear understanding of kind of this evolution of what's next for me as a young adult. Where am I going? What's coming down the road? And who should I be looking up to? Who should I be emulating? And we got to talking, and he said, well, have you ever thought about working at a camp? And I said, well, I actually have 15 years of experience at a camp. And he said, I'd like to start one. And so he and I became partners in creating the camp. And so we were the founders, and he hired me on as the camp's first director. And what we really wanted to do was to create kind of a atmosphere that felt like a brotherhood, that was one campfire or one classroom, right? And where everyone's voice could be heard, but where there was a diversity of ages, so that these people, these young boys who came, they were all male identified in 2015 when we started. And our first year we had 15 boys, and it was tuition free. We wanted it to be tuition free so that anyone could have access. We only advertised by word of mouth, and we wanted to just invite people who might not have a male role model in their life who they could look up to at that moment. And we said, we're not going to ask any questions. There's not going to be an application that says why, but just if you know someone who just could maybe use some time to be around some other boys who feel a little bit like brothers, come join us. And we all slept in tents, and we did it for 5 nights our first year. That was one session, was 5 nights with 15 boys. And we created this, this model where each night we would have a guest speaker who was at the next kind of age of their own evolution. So we had a teenager speak the first night and kind of tell their story and talk about their life. Then we had someone in their 20s, someone in their 40s, and then the last night, someone who was 75 or 80, talk about what it felt like to be an old boy, right? A boy who had grown up, who was toward the end. And through that process, we really talked about this notion of a tender warrior and being someone who can simultaneously feel brave and courageous, but also someone who can be vulnerable, someone who can talk about their own well-being, who can talk about their mental health and talk about the parts that are hard and not just have to have this steely exterior. And there are so many resources for young people to talk about their wellness and, their own self-care now. I am just in awe of my 7th and 8th graders and the way that they're able to articulate their needs and their way that they're able to pause in their day. Some students use meditation, some students journal, but there are so many tools available for young people today that I'm just so grateful to everyone. I feel like I'm standing on, as when I started the camp in 2015, that I was standing on the shoulders of giants because there are so many people doing such good work for young people right now in that area.
That's such an inspiring story to hear how you went from working at a camp previously, taking a break, and then just through conversation with the man that you started a camp with, we're able to start this camp. So have you all had sessions in the past couple of years, or did it kind of stop with the pandemic? And how's it look today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So it lasted for 3 years. And then the property that we had used, I had 3 children at the time. And so my kids were getting to an age where I couldn't commit to being a full-time teacher and a full-time camp director. So I had to take a step away from that role. And then the gentleman who I partnered with had a sabbatical year in Australia. And so that was where we really put a pause on it. And one of the really nice things, though, is that we now have this network of 3 years worth of, volunteer staff who worked with us, of these young men who spent time with us, who are out there in the world, right, sort of sowing the same seeds that we did. And we get to stay in touch with that group. And, when I think about it, and I think about it as a venture, it wasn't an investment in terms of a money-making investment, right? We were trying to provide something free for these people to have access. But the amount of work that went into it with, really creating a camp, going through our state Department of Camps and Recreation and Child Services, getting the food, prep, and going through all these trainings. There was a swimming pool on site at the house that was adjacent to the property where we were camping. And so we had to, go through the town inspector and the health inspector. And for me, that experience of doing it without a ton of financial gain, without a long-term investment, just out of the fulfillment and it feeling like it was the right thing to do, and just to say yes because it sounded so exciting, was such a thrill. And I think it bolstered my confidence in one's ability to say yes to something and then believe in it and kind of see it into fruition. And so I think, in my role now, I'm one of my administrative role is I'm director of community engagement at my school. And my own children, who are now 11, 10, and 8, always joke that my job is just I get to walk around town and become best friends with everybody. And I love that about the life of a school. I love it about meeting parents in the car line at drop off. I love it about, walking into the donut shop or the library at town and just making these connections, because I think, just like you said, you never know where one conversation is going to take something. And I think if we limit ourselves to what we know or what we've seen previously, we're hindering our ability to raise the ceiling of what we're capable of as a community. And so that's really, if I were to pare down kind of my pedagogy or my educational philosophy, it comes to those connections between human beings. I think that independent learning and relationships with other people are really what the age group that I teach is all about. It's about being able to advocate for yourself and learn on your own and have those tools of curiosity and engagement and application. And then also just connecting with the people around you. Those are skills that are, some folks might call them soft skills, or skills that are more qualitative in nature because they're hard to measure, but they're so important in the world today.
Some of the community members that you maybe used to help promote the camp when you were using the word of mouth during those 3 years, are those the same community members that you sometimes work with for your school now? Does that kind of come full circle, or?
So I just transitioned to a new school this year.
Okay.
So after 13 years of really becoming a part of, one other school's fabric of their community, my family and I made a transition. And so it's been really neat because when I first joined that community, I was only 2 years out of college. And now here I am, 15 years into a teaching career and being a relative rookie, if you will, in a new community, and being in my first year has been really exciting for me because I underestimated how much I'd transformed over those 13 years, right? You look at yourself in the mirror every day and you forget how much you've changed because you see these incremental changes. But then, when I really stepped into this new role as both a teacher and director of community engagement in a community I was just myself getting to know, it was a really exciting opportunity to listen so well and to prioritize conversations. And, I think when you're in a new position, you can ask as many questions as you want, and I think depending on your organization that you're joining or the community, maybe there's a time period on that and people start getting irritated with you for asking questions. But I've loved that opportunity as I kind of approach the middle stage of my career as an educator, to get to know a new community and introduce myself to them as I am now, not as I kind of have grown to be.
Yeah, and that's a good way of using those skills also, even though that was a different community. And, you can always become a better educator and support your students when you are finding out about kind of where they go after school, right? What are some of the interests that they have in the community? Let's talk a little bit about your writing. So you've written a blog, you've been writing for media. So talk to me a little bit about some of the writing process, time management, what kind of features that you've published on media as well.
Yeah, so I mentioned early on, that I kind of live in the present tense, that I'm very improvisational, that I have learned to create systems where I can be organized and learned how to prioritize time and manage time and plan ahead and things like that. But it doesn't come naturally to me. It's not just, if I have a Saturday, that's not my natural inclination. And yet, with writing, I realized that I was missing some self-reflection, that I was moving at such a fast pace. I'm a runner. I had my young kids at the time. And I sort of realized I need a way to process what I'm learning from my students. I think, our students, I think children that we spend time with are our greatest teachers because they can reflect back to us how we're being perceived, what their energy is. They feed off of us, and they often can just speak in a way that is so much more lucid than adults who kind of try to stick to niceties or wax poetic about things and use big words and jargon. And kids often just cut straight to the point and can say things in really thoughtful ways. So I wanted to learn from my students and reflect back what they were teaching me. But I knew that if I tried to start a blog or a podcast or anything like that, that I was going to hold myself to such a standard of excellence that it would take me days and days and days, maybe weeks, to actually produce something that I was proud of and felt like was finished and worthy of publication. And so I had to create for myself a system where every Thursday I would write for 30 minutes. I called it the Thursday 30. And I would hit publish wherever I was after 30 minutes. And I said, so these are the parameters of this blog. Everyone who reads it knows this. And so now it feels like a safe space for me to just write something, stream of consciousness. Here's something I've learned this week. And every Thursday, even though I don't have any time, I can make 30 minutes every Thursday in my schedule. And so I started doing it. And I just found myself throughout the week thinking about what I was going to write the following Thursday. And so by sort of habit stacking these two habits, one, having Thursday this one time, and then two, needing to know what I was going to write about, I was creating this reflective process in my day. I'd go for runs and I'd think about, what did I learn today? Was there any morsel that I could attach to this theme I'm starting to draw out of the past week in my life? And I became a much more reflective person. And I think, I draw so much of my reflection from my partner and spouse, and she is a former educator and a life coach. And so much of what she does is around communication and about knowing yourself. And so when I think about the pace that I live at, she's such a good challenger to me in that way. And so I think that finding people who challenge me is really important. That as good as it feels for me to have someone who is my biggest fan and is going to tell me I'm amazing no matter what I do and affirm me, I also really appreciate those coworkers and parents and even students who model that same thing that I've found to be so invaluable in my personal and professional life. Which is just that ability to challenge and to say, I'm not entirely sure you're using that word the way you think you are, or can I offer you a piece of advice that I'd want if I were in your shoes? And, seeking out people who really have this kind of radical way of communicating clearly, but who also care about me is so important. And so that reflective process of writing is important. And I ended up writing, each day I write 2 letters to my students. I just have a little notepad of stationery that I write, that I create, and it has a little caricature of myself. And it just says, "High five from Mr. McDonough." And so I just give 2 of my students a little handwritten note saying, "Hey, I saw you, connecting with that younger student today when they were locked out of the building. That means so much to them. And I'm sure they think the world of you now." Or, "Hey, I saw you take a risk. You weren't quite sure of yourself, but you raised your hand anyway. That's incredibly brave. And I admire you for it." And so that notion of writing, I was like, well, where else can I kind of hack writing into my daily routine? Oh, I don't have time to write a thoughtful letter and put it in the mail with a postage stamp to a child's parents, but I have time to just jot a quick note twice a day. And so I think for my own time management, for my own process of organization and connection, writing has been a really helpful tool to do that, because it feels daunting to write a handwritten narrative. But when I do that on a regular basis, then when I do reach out to parents about something troubling that their child's going through, they might begin with, "Oh my goodness, thank you for reaching out. And by the way, that note that you sent home with Sarah the other day, that absolutely meant the world to her. And do you know it's still on her bulletin board?" Or something like, when I'm writing comments at the end of a trimester, it just makes it easier because the child already knows that I believe in them. They already know that, and they have this tangible reminder. And so it goes both ways. I think that, so being reflective has been super helpful in that way through writing.
Yeah, and just writing those short notes, I think, like, those are things they'll keep for years to come. And, I think of that as a school leader, like writing notes to staff members and words of appreciation. It's like one of those right? Words of appreciation, feeling like they're noticed as students, right? Just like you said, you don't have to really think about doing it. You just write something short. And I really like how you said, over a period of time, you would write these 20-minute or these 30-minute blogs, right? It doesn't matter if it wasn't fine-tuned, you just put it out there. So yeah, if we have a habit we want to form, it's just doing it, right? It's about getting in the process. I really like how you talked about being reflective in, how you've used your reflective writing to help your students as well. Out of everything we talked about today on the podcast, what's one thing you'd like the listeners to remember?
Did you ask it again? What's one thing that I've what?
You'd like listeners to remember?
I guess the thing I'd want listeners to remember is, for so many people right now, I think especially, it feels like there's not enough time. right? I know that I'm someone who wishes there were 26 hours in the day so I could have 2 extra hours to either care for myself or get something done. And we see all the apps that you could download to your phone about managing time. And it just feels like, I think to many, that the pace is quickening. And I think one thing that I have to relearn every single day, but that I have learned and that I appreciate, is that there are ways to use time better, that centering ourselves, being more mindful, for me, asking that question about, gosh, is there time for me to reflect throughout the day? Well, maybe not every day, but throughout the week. Or I'm feeling like my students aren't hearing me when I'm affirming them after class because they're in a rush to get to science class or to get to recess, or they hear criticism through a megaphone and, any affirmation like a whisper. And so giving them a little piece of paper that has a note jotted on it, kind of, they can hang on to that and they can remember and they can believe it. And so I think that's the one thing, is just that there is time. And we think so much about the chronological time, the chronos time, but the origin of that word time in ancient Greek, there were 2 words for time. One was chronos, which meant the time on the clock, but the other was kairos. And kairos, Kairos, to the Greeks meant the most opportune time that you could do something. And so instead of 1 o'clock or 1:30 or 2:45, it was, oh, this is the exact right moment to have that conversation, or the exact right moment to slow down and appreciate the sunset. Has nothing to do with the time on the clock and everything to do with what's happening around me. And so I think schools are so predictably built on the schedule and time. And so that's the thing that I would hope folks take away from this, is that building in time for what our needs are, both as educators, both as stewards of our students' progress and facilitators of conversation, as educational leaders. Sometimes it's as easy as thinking, well, I might not have time for everything, but what do I have time for, and what's important, but maybe not urgent.
I really like that, pointing out what is the most opportune time, right? Instead of looking at the chronological time. Step back and enjoy what's happening. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
Yeah, so I am active on Twitter. You can find me at Mr. McDonough, MrMcDonough. My website is will-mcdonough.com. And my Instagram is WSMcDonough. So those are 3 places you can find me.
I'll make sure to include those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was a pleasure talking with you and learning more about your practices and your teaching and community engagement.
Thank you so much, Dana. I look forward to connecting again in the future.